From Miami Law, I'm Annette Uguez, and this is The Explainer.
As these intense weather-related events increase, risk pooling is likely to be less effective, right? Because we're not just thinking about insurance policies with respect to hurricanes, we're thinking about a range of different weather-related risks that can affect more customers, and so diversification is more complicated.
Welcome to Season 15 of the Miami Law Explainer, the legal affairs podcast where University of Miami law experts lend context and historical relevance to today's headlines. With disaster costs exceeding $2.9 trillion since 1980, on today's show, financial law scholar Caroline Bradley shines a light on how financial firms are managing the escalating risk of climate change as U.S. regulators step back on climate rules. Let's go to executive producer Catherine Skip with the interview.
Good morning, Caroline.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thank you for having me.
So with U.S. regulators stepping back on climate rules while disaster costs exceed $2.9 trillion since 1980, how should financial firms manage the risks associated with these disasters?
Thank you. Well, there are two basic sets of risks that are associated with climate change that financial firms need to deal with. One is the physical risks associated with these severe weather-related events. And the other is transition risks, which involve the costs associated with regulation. So in the United States, as we're deregulating with respect to climate change, we are reducing those transition risks domestically, but the physical risks remain. Shifting the focus of financial regulation doesn't actually change very much the risks that financial firms need to deal with. They still need to think about these physical risks. And at some point, the impact of these weather-related events even become material for the purposes of existing U.S. securities laws. So public companies that are subject to securities regulation at the federal level will need to account at some point for serious physical risks associated with climate change. So it's not as though firms can ignore even the transition risks, even the risks associated with regulation. Efforts to address climate change, generally speaking, involve climate change mitigation, which is focusing on reducing levels of greenhouse gases and slowing climate change. But they also focus on adaptation. And if we're not focusing on mitigation so much, we actually need to think more about adaptation, which is increasing resilience of physical assets to weather-related events.
The insurance industry is facing record claims, leading to higher premiums and new catastrophic bonds. Is the traditional insurance model sustainable as these climate events worsen?
Yes, well, we're seeing increasing numbers of increasingly severe weather-related events, hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, and also extreme heat. And these developments are very costly. One recent study estimated that climate change could cost $38 billion a year by 2049. So the costs are significant and they're increasing. Insurance basically works on the basis of risk pooling. Insurers write policies, they pool the risks. That assumes that not all of their customers are going to be making claims at any one time. So they're basically diversifying their risk across a broad pool of customers. The trouble is that as these intense weather-related events increase, risk pooling is likely to be less effective, right? Because we're not just thinking about insurance policies with respect to hurricanes, we're thinking about a range of different weather-related risks that can affect more customers, and so diversification is more complicated. Traditionally, we think that insurance deals with these sorts of risks by increasing premium levels. Sometimes regulation impedes the ability of insurers to pass on those costs. And there's also an issue that regulators, particularly in some jurisdictions, in California and in New York, they've worried about this. They worry about the idea of whether people can actually get insurance, right? So there's an access to insurance issue that we need to worry about as well, which raises, these these questions. So yes, insurance companies are focusing on new sort of techniques to deal with these risks. They're focusing on issuing catastrophe bonds. So investors will actually buy these catastrophe bonds as investments. They get a good payout, which is beneficial if it turns out that the catastrophe doesn't incur. They lose their principal, the principal of their investment, if the catastrophe does occur. So that's sort of helpful because it pushes the risk away from insurance companies onto new categories of people, of investors. But it's not the answer to this problem. There are also parametric insurance policies which involve a similar sort of idea of payouts on the occurrence of particular defined events. And these can be taken out by businesses, these policies, or in some cases, municipalities might decide to take out parametric insurance that would cover the risk of a particular type of event affecting their municipality, and then the municipality would figure out how to distribute the proceeds. But these are complicated issues, and I think we haven't solved the issue. Insurance is the place where we're going to notice issues in the financial system first. And it's not just about property insurance as well, because we also know that extreme heat causes significant health issues. So there are issues for health insurance and again, issues as to whether people who are affected by these heat events actually have the sort of insurance coverage that they need to address those issues. Complicated situation.
As bank regulators narrow their focus to exclude risk like climate change, what protects the financial system if a major weather event causes widespread loan defaults?
Yes, so we know that extreme weather events do cause risks of default on loans for banks. Banks are going to be affected. For example, Tropical Storm Helene in Asheville, in North Carolina, particularly in Asheville in 2024, businesses closed down. Businesses closed down, the employees of those businesses lost their incomes. Asheville depends a lot on tourism, and so, in this environment where large numbers of buildings had been washed away by the very intense flooding, you had a situation where the traditional economic viability of the place was impeded because tourists weren't going there, businesses were closed down. We know that in the wake of these extreme weather events, payday lending increases, right? So people look to expensive borrowing. We also know that these types of events cause people to miss payments on their loans, both individuals and also businesses, and that's a problem. So now, with respect to an individual weather event, that's not so much of a problem for the financial system as a whole. It might be an issue for particular banks, particularly smaller banks whose lending is focused on a particular geographic area. But the banks still need to pay attention to these risks because an accumulation of these extreme weather events has the risk of more systemic impact, right? So banks need to pay attention to these risks for that reason. They also need to be concerned about the fact that this is not a stable situation, right? What's happening with these extreme weather events is we're having an intensification of these events. They're becoming more pervasive, right? And so at some point, there is a possibility that these types of risks cause systemic issues. We know that in the financial system, systemic issues arise out of unexpected events like the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, and the financial crisis of 2008, to some extent provoked by defaults by numbers of borrowers on their loans, which had been incorporated into securitizations, and the market lost confidence in the valuation of assets, right? So financial stability issues are often going to arise out of a sudden loss of confidence. And the impact of these extreme weather events as it accumulates and as the issues become more pervasive and more intense, that is the sort of thing that can cause those sorts of financial stability issues. Climate change has been recognized by international financial regulators as being a source of financial instability. And so then deregulation interferes with our ability to address those issues, right? If in the US we're not sort of encouraging financial institutions to focus on these issues, and the financial institutions themselves aren't paying attention, then there is a potential source of risk to the financial system.
Mm-hmm. True. How do U.S. financial firms navigate operating globally when American climate regulations are loosening while other major economies, like the EU, maintain stricter rules?
So this is particularly an issue for larger businesses. In terms of a compliance issue, it's particularly an issue for larger businesses. In the United States, although the SEC has backed away from the rules that were introduced in 2024, they were actually previously put on hold as a result of litigation to challenge the rules. And that litigation is currently stalled while the SEC tries to figure out what it wants to do with those rules. Does it want to propose new rules? What does it want to do about the issue? But California has disclosure rules with respect to greenhouse gas emissions that have an impact on larger businesses doing business in California. Mm-hmm. Those rules are also subject to challenge for the same sorts of reasons that the federal rules were. We don't know what's going to be the eventual outcome of that. But domestic businesses in the United States do have to, if they're doing significant business and if they reach the relevant size levels, have to worry about these California rules. Very large businesses that are also doing business in areas like the European Union, which has more has different approaches to thinking about climate change, focusing on double materiality, right? Not just what are the problems of climate change for businesses, but what problems does business activity cause for the climate? This is an idea of double materiality, which we have never signed on to in the United States. Businesses that become subject to those rules are actually going to have to comply with those rules. So it depends very much on what the businesses are doing. We know that European-based businesses are more inclined to be taking issues of sustainability and adjusting to climate change more seriously than businesses that have been based in the United States, although businesses based in the United States need to focus on issues of resilience, and you know that is an important issue, as we just talked about.
Given the shift away from climate mitigation policy, what is the financial sector's role in funding the adaptation and resilience projects needed to protect their investment from inevitable physical risks?
Yes, so one of the interesting things recently is that it's not that we're moving. Regulation may be disincentivizing work on climate change mitigation, but in a world where renewable energy is increasingly prevalent and is actually cheaper sometimes than electricity produced from coal plants, for example, there are financial incentives to invest in some strategies that relate to mitigation. That's more the case in China these days than it is in the US, and particularly in a context where in the US we've been pulling permits for wind and solar farms.
Right.
You know, that is an issue. So, you know, the idea that it's not financially rewarding to invest in renewables is not accurate, right? It is something that businesses can make money on. In terms of adaptation, I guess there are two sets of issues that we might want to think about. One is adaptation at the global level. So one of the things that policymakers worry about is the idea that many developing countries don't have the resources to develop resilience and to adapt to climate change. And that is a huge need. There is a huge need for financial resources. And recently it's been estimated that adaptation is chronically underfunded, with only about 10% of developing countries' adaptation needs being met through international climate finance. That's a big problem. And it's a big problem because it has other more it's going to encourage immigration flows when countries become unlivable as a result of climate change, sea level rise, and these increasing extreme weather events. So it's not just an issue of, what happens in the developing countries. It affects potentially other places as well. Adaptation within the domestic system is something that financial firms do have some incentives to sort of think about. If we think about the issues with respect to insurance, it makes sense for insurance companies to charge lower rates for customers who are engaging in building resilience into their properties. And the same thing for bank lending, right? It is the case that for banks, when they're making decisions as to lending, it makes sense for them to think about, it being more a better bet to lend to businesses and to people who are engaging in building resilience into their operations. So there are some economic incentives to think about adaptation, although, from my perspective, I think, policy approaches focusing on encouraging resilience would be more desirable.
Well, this has been enlightening, terrifying. I think I'm just going to go lie under my bed for the rest of the year. But I really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. See you around.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Miami Law Explainer. If you enjoy our show, leave us a 5-star review with your podcast provider and ask your friends to subscribe. Our show is engineered and edited by Christopher Alzadi with theme music composed by Rady Kim from the Frost School of Music. I'm your host, Annette Uguez.